दसिया बार तेरे हजूर चो नसिया ओ बार तेरे हजूर चो नसिया तू कीता माफी दा ऐलान यीशु मेरी बरकत तू
Worthy is the Lamb, worthy is the Lamb, you are holy, holy, are you Lord God Almighty, worthy is the
लोग जुर्म से भी नफरत करते हैं और मुजरम से भी नफरत करते हैं, लेकिन सुनिए इंजील का पैगाम है इब्ने आदम खोए हुए को ढूंढने और निजात देने आए हैं। दुनिया हुकूमतें बागियों को ढूंढती हैं मारने के लिए, लेकिन यीशु मसीह गुनहगारों को ढूंढता है निजात देने के लिए, मारने के लिए नहीं, हलाक करने के लिए नहीं, उनको ढूंढता है निजात देने के लिए।
so excited to push things forward in the body of Christ. Well, this video was sent to us this week by some of the leaders in Pakistan. They had just released it, and they tried to put together some of the activities going on in Pakistan. We have two major leaders we work with. I'm not on. Yes, the Holy Spirit just told me I'm not on. Hallelujah. Yeah. So our leaders that we work with in Pakistan just put this together and sent us. There's two major leaders we work with over there, and most of them are coming. At least they're sending some of their teams coming here to America as of today, because we have this annual conference coming, and we have some leaders coming from Africa that we used to be working there 17 years, but now the Middle East. Those big open-air meetings are when we have evangelistic crusades. You don't call them crusades over there. We just call them outreaches or prayer gatherings. But about every 6 weeks, we are helping them host one of these gatherings across the Middle East. And there's usually anywhere from 200,000 to 1 million Muslims come every 6 weeks to some location. And over 80% of them are raising their hands wanting to receive Christ right now. So that's what's going on in the Middle East. That's the real news. The building you saw there of the school, you financed most of the construction of that building. We have now 4 Bible colleges also, 2 buildings, the other 2 Bible colleges we still rent. But one of them right now is just finishing construction. It's on the border of Afghanistan, Pakistan, because the pastors can sneak across the border from Afghanistan and study at our Bible college right on the border there, and then they sneak back. So that's been pretty cool. Just over 100 pastors have been graduating each year, going out and starting churches. We've been able to buy quite a few motorcycles for pastors also this year, which is kind of cool. Because many pastors will oversee anywhere from 10 to 20 churches, and they're walking. They often walk 20 miles a day just to go see their churches. But it's a different world over there, and we just appreciate all the help. We have also built a home for abused women since January. And you as a church, part of the Christmas offering, paid for that. Because many women, when they receive Jesus Christ, will get beaten up by their husbands. And it was when we were there last time, there was a woman there whose bones were pretty broken up, having been beaten by her husband for receiving Jesus. And it broke my heart, and I cried to Dave and said, Dave, I got to do something to help these ladies. And so part of that offering that you took is now providing for this home for women after they get beat up. Yes. So I get to bring the word to you. A couple of times a year I get to be here. This is our home church, for those of you who don't know, but because we're traveling all the time, we don't get to be with you very often. But Linda and I are also always delighted to see everybody that we know. And you are in a series as a community going through the book of Romans. So I'm jumping right in here, and I'm going to be teaching Romans chapters 9, 10, and 11. So I just got about 20 minutes here to go through these 3 chapters. And I am going to zip through, so much so you will now know everything in these 3 chapters. There are 2 main subjects that are dealt with in these 2 subjects, and I'm going to break it down just to dealing with those 2 issues. In Romans chapter 9, I'm going to be reading a verse about how God is involved in this world, and in particular, to what degree is he controlling things? Has he predestined everything? And this is a major issue for the last 2,000 years of Christianity. In the context of the verse that I'm about to read to you, Paul, the writer of this passage, is laying out doctrinal truths. And I think you already understand, those of you who've been part of this discussion, this series, know that Romans is the part of the Bible where doctrines are laid one line upon another to lay out Christian foundational truths, more than any other place in the Bible. Well, here in chapters 9, 10, and 11, there's 2 major doctrines dealt with, and this first doctrine has to do with how involved is God in this world. Is he controlling everything you and I do? Is he controlling it to the extent that before this world was even created, he decided that today you'd be sitting where you're at. You're going to be guided, decided by him what you're going to do throughout the rest of this day. And this chapter is used to promote that view of determinism, called determinism, because it gives a discussion. how God got involved first in these two young guys who were born of the same parents, got involved in their lives, and before they were even born, God chose to favor one over the other. This discussion that God could choose before these babies are born to favor one over the other can lead us to conclude that God is making decisions before us, before we're created, and therefore everything is predetermined. He gives one more example, the writer does, Paul, here in this chapter, about Pharaoh, God directing forcefully something that he did. Now, Pharaoh was the head of Egypt, and there was a time in history when the Jews, at that time called Hebrews, were slaves in Egypt. And Pharaoh was leading Egypt, and God saw the oppression of the Hebrew people as slaves, so he sent Moses to set them free. Moses came to Pharaoh, and God used Moses to manifest incredible signs in the heavens, signs throughout Egypt, miracles. And Pharaoh saw those signs, but God hardened Pharaoh's heart so he would not immediately let the Hebrew people go. And the discussion here in Romans 9 is explaining how God sovereignly intervened in history, took Pharaoh's heart, hardened it so he would not respond to Moses until God had worked all the miracles, demonstrated himself in all of these ways, and then God softened his heart to let the Hebrew people go free. Having made those two examples and discussing it, Paul, the writer here, is trying to demonstrate God's involvement in this world and how God can, at any time, direct what he wants to direct. And now I'll read one verse here that kind of is the summary of this whole way of thinking. It's Romans chapter 9, and I'll read verse 18. Paul's quoting, referring to how God acted in the Old Testament. So then, he has mercy on whom he desires, and he hardens whom he desires. This is kind of summarizing it, bringing it to the apex of importance right here, because he's trying to say God is sovereign. God can do whatever he wants, and in his choosing to do whatever he wants, sometimes he'll show mercy to this person, and a different person he won't show mercy to. He can do it because he's God. Then in the next few verses he says, and who are you to complain about what God does? God is like the potter of clay. Potter can decide what to make a pot for. He can make one pot for honorable use, another clay pot for eating, another clay pot for putting garbage in. And he says the potter has the authority to do whatever he wants, and you and I, we are just human beings. We cannot respond to God and say that's unfair. So that's the main discussion, and that's the reason why this passage is often used to argue, to debate about how involved is God in this world. Those who like to think God controls everything love to go to Romans chapter 9 to prove it. But there are actually two different ways at looking at this. And I want to put in a little diagram so you can see polarized two different views, two different ways of viewing this, one called determinism, and the other one called deism. Now, people who study these kind of things or go to Bible school, they know that when we read this, we will come to certain conclusions depending on which lens are we looking through. At one polar end, we have deism, at the other polar end, determinism. Determinism is the view that, yes, God has determined everything, every minute detail, long before we are even created. If you could put up that contrast, I'd like you to understand that determinism is the predominant view in Western Christianity. But it might not surprise you. I disagree with it, as I'll show you in a minute. At the other end is called deism. Now, deism is the belief that God created the world, but he's no longer involved in the world. That God created the world like a clock that got wound up. Then he lets the clock continue, lets the earth run on its own while he stands back and just watches it. And he will not get involved again until Judgment Day when this natural creation is destroyed. That's called deism, the belief that God, yes, created the world and he'll judge the world when it's all over, but he's not involved in the meantime. In the founding of our country, we have many great leaders and especially presidents just over half of our presidents were deists, not Christians. Just over half of our U.S. presidents for the first 50 years, they were deists, believing that yes, God created the world, it's running on its own, and he will judge the world, but he's not involved. And many times in their writings, they talk about God, but they're talking about a God who has stepped back from creation and is just watching. The other half of our presidents and those in leadership positions, they were devout Christians, and the Christian view is that God is involved. But notice the extreme. At one end, we have a God who's not involved at all. The other extent, we have determinism, which every minute detail is controlled, even the thoughts you have. Now, on the determinism end has been where major leaders in Christianity have been. Great giants, like some of you who know church history would recognize the name Augustine, Martin Luther, or John Calvin. They all were determinists, believing God determines every minute detail. So also, we deal much in the Muslim world. All Muslims are determinists. They believe everything is as Allah wills. And therefore, whether good or bad happens, they will say it's God's will. They will just allow it to happen to them. If they fall out of the pew right now, they would say, oh, well, I'm glad that's over. It was predestined from the foundation of the world. Whatever you go through, they believe is Allah's will. But now, here we are at a place where we've got these two polar ends of the spectrum, deist and determinism. But if you continue reading here in Romans, you will find out that the rest of the chapter and the following chapter, he talks about human choice. And the reason it's important to talk about human choice is because it's actually the opposite of determinism. If God has determined everything you do, think, or say, then you have no free choice. And those great giants, Augustine, Martin Luther, and John Calvin, they all believed that humans have no free choice. They did not believe in any human choice. They believed that God controls every little detail. Now, I was trained in that way of thinking in one of the seminaries that I attended. But through the years, I have come to shift my entire view. We have the whole spectrum from deism to determinism, and I would propose to you that truth is somewhere in the middle. That truth is seeing God not relate to this earth as a determinist, nor as deism would teach us, but as God relates to the world as a father. How does a father relate to his family? How does he deal with his children? That a father looks down, a parent looks down, and they can get involved whenever they want. There will be times when they answer their children's prayers. There'll be other times when they know they should not answer their prayers. There'll be times when a parent will intervene and steer their life. Times they'll give them guidance. Times that they will just let the child make its own mistakes so they learn. I would propose to you that the true biblical image of God is not a God who's determined everything, nor is it a God who is standing back, but as a God who deals with this earth as a father deals with his family. The father understanding. And the next slide I put that God is selectively involved in this world. That between the two extremes, we have a God who gets involved when he wants. And there's actually a different understanding of the word sovereign. Determinists, they equate the word sovereign with God can do anything and he's controlling all. Where people who understand God as a father and he's relating to the world as a father, they'll use the same word sovereign, but the definition of sovereign for them is God can do whatever he wants to do. And in fact, if he sovereignly wants to, he can step back and decide not to control things. He can decide to give us free will. And the position that I have come to hold is that when God created the earth, he created a world that runs according to natural laws. And yes, as a deist would say, it's like a clock wound up and it is running. But it doesn't stop there. Yes, this world runs according to natural laws, but then God put humanity on the earth, gave them free will, and gave them responsibility to manage this earth. And because he's given us responsibility, he's given us authority to decide. And some things will not happen unless we rise up and manage the earth. But it doesn't end there. The understanding God as a father also says God continues to be involved in this earth, steering things to the degree that he has an understanding where it'll all end, but he also steers this earth in individual human beings, both by his relationship with them, by his spirit. He has angels interacting with this world, and God, to whatever degree he chooses, can be involved. And when you look at the Bible, you see things like God intervening. And indeed, the very idea that God intervenes proves he's not controlling everything. Because if God was controlling everything, he would not have to intervene. The problem with determinism, that God has determined every little detail, is then you think of God controlling everything, and if God controls everything, we have no free will. Plus, this God controlling everything means he's responsible for everything. If God controls everything, then he's responsible for war and disease. He's responsible for babies that die. He's responsible for every good or bad thing that's ever happened. Unfortunately, most people in the Western world have only been offered two views of God. Either deism, which says God started it all and now he's not doing anything, or a God who's controlling everything. And if God's controlling everything, then he is responsible for all the sickness and pain and suffering. And I have a hard time believing in that God. The greatest complaint atheists have against Christianity is saying, how can there be the Christian God if indeed there's so much evil in the world? Well, people who are not at either a polar extreme, but they see God relating as a father to the earth, they answer that and says the reason there's so much evil is because we have free will. The reason there's so much evil is because God's not controlling everything. In fact, the Christian belief that I would propose to you is that God is grieved in his heart when things are not going the way he wishes they were going. And we pray, as Jesus taught us to pray, thy kingdom come, thy will be done. We're praying for his will to be done because right now his will is not being done on earth. There are many people rebelling to God. There are many people not doing God's will. There is still an interaction and a struggle. Now we're praying, thy kingdom come, thy will be done. We want your reign to be done down here. And indeed, a day will come in the future when Jesus Christ returns. Then every knee bow, every tongue will confess. Then he'll be in control. Then, the Bible says, there'll be no more pain, no more sorrow. There'll be no more death or sickness when he returns and then takes control. But in the present time in world events, God is not controlling everything. God has delegated to humanity some sense of responsibility, and yes, he's still involved. He wants to help us. He wants to be with you. But therefore, if you become someone who understands God as a loving father, you don't blame him for all the bad stuff that happens. You say, no, we live in a world that runs according to natural laws. We live in a world where people are rebelling to God. But we're looking for a day in the future when God does control everything, and then there'll be no more pain or suffering. But in the present time, when you go through suffering, you may go to God and ask, and as a parent, as a father, he may answer. But there are other times you're still struggling and you don't see the answer. But God didn't determine the pain you're going through. However, he is with you, caring for you. He is working with you. And he is grieving with you if you're going through grief. It's a God who's looked down and sees his children when they go through difficult times. And he is not one who predestined it from the foundation of the world which you go through, but he has entered in relationship with us and walks with us through whatever we're going. Now, when someone presents various ideas and they're trying to help other people embrace those ideas, it's very common for a teacher to put at two polar extremes, one view and the other polar extreme the other. And then just to make his way of thinking more reasonable, put his own view right in the middle. Now, of course, I wouldn't do that, but some teachers will choose the two polar ends to make it look like, well, I've considered both polar ends, but I'm more reasonable than either of those weirdos, and I'm in the middle. Again, not me, of course, but praise to God. I would propose to you, if you read your Bible, you will come to that view. Now, There's one other issue real quickly that I want to lay out here, and I'm just going to jump ahead because in Romans chapter 11, and I don't even need to read it because there's a discussion about where the Jewish people belong, how are we supposed to look at them in the future. And it says in chapter 11, verse 1, I say then, God has not rejected his people, has he? May it never be. For I too am an Israelite, a descendant of Abraham. So the other doctrinal view that Paul lays out is, what about the Jewish people? And in particular, you got two polar extremes the same way. You've got Christians today who are at one end, and it's called replacement theology, which believes that when Jesus died on the cross, God pushed the Jews aside. No longer is he favoring the Jews, and God has chosen the Christians to be the center of his affection. That the Christians have replaced the Jews in history. At the other polar extreme, you've got what's called Zionism. Zionism simply means those who support Jews. That's a simple definition. But more particularly in Christian circles, it means supporting Jews to the extent where you want all the Jews in the world to migrate back to Israel because God is still going to fulfill his promises to Israel and make them a great nation in the earth. That's called Zionism in two different extremes. Now, we've had battles in our nation about these for people who know what's going on behind the scenes. For example, President Bush, number 2, when he started off in office, was being counseled by Zionists, believing that all Jews should migrate back to Israel, and God would fulfill his promise, and eventually the Jews would inherit the land promised to Abraham. At that time, in the beginning of his presidency, he was supporting the Jews taking over. But about halfway through his presidency, somehow he was counseled to switch. And then he changed his position and said we need a two-state solution. And the two-state solution was an alternative answer saying, no, we have both partial Jews living there and partially the Arabs living there, and they should get along in peace. Well, as soon as he did that, many great leaders, church leaders here in our country, abandoned support of President Bush because they didn't like that Jewish switch. Because according to Zionists, the view that Jews should migrate back and own the land, then we should support them taking over all. There shouldn't be two states. There should only be one state, and the Jews should own everything from Iraq down to Egypt because that's what was promised to Abraham. At the other extreme, we've got the replacement Christians who say, no, God's done with the Jews. The only thing that matters now is Christians. And now we have these two polar extremes, and yet now we have the right answer in the middle. I hope you understand. I might be exaggerating that point. Because to make a point, a teacher will often put the two extremes, as I said, and choose to say, well, what about this middle ground? Let's consider it. There's a third way called one new man. And one new man is the understanding that, no, God has not done with the Jews. And as I read one verse here, God has not rejected the Jews, has he? No. Paul goes on and explains the Jews simply have been hardened for a time, so they do not respond to Jesus Christ until the end of time. And Paul explains that when the fullness of Gentiles, non-Jews, when God has brought a huge harvest of non-Jews from the earth into a belief of Jesus, then God will turn his eyes back to the Jews, open up their eyes, and then they will accept Jesus as Messiah. If the outcome of that view, that God still has plans for the Jewish people in the end times before the return, the out view of that is an understanding that God will make Jews and non-Jews together as one, worship Jesus together, and therefore the Middle East will not just be Jews, but one new man creating Jews and Gentiles to walk together as one new man. That's the right answer for those of you who want to know the truth. Now, finally, in closing, let me say, back when we were in seminary, I used to argue these things with the other students, and they'd argue back. It was just, what you did after you eat lunch is you argue and you debate. And you'd have hours and hours of arguing, especially these two issues. And when it's all said and done, most of it I look back today, because it's been 40 years, it didn't produce a whole lot. You can argue doctrine, and there are some individuals who need to understand these things, but for the vast majority of Christians, you just got to bubble it right on down. I would hope that if we bubble all this down to what's left over, you understand God's a father. He's not controlling everything. He relates to you that you're his child. And you're doing good if that's your understanding of God, how he relates to this world. And then on the other hand, Jewish perspective, how then should we look at the Jews? Well, Paul explained, we should still honor the Jews because of the forefathers. That we as God's people in Jesus Christ should realize God chose the Jews in the Old Testament times. God's not done with them. He is going to open their eyes before the end of the world. They will recognize Jesus as Messiah. But in the meantime, while they're not in masses becoming Christian, we still should honor them because of the forefathers. Because Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, because God used them to bring certain truths into the world. And even though most have rejected Jesus as a people group, we're still to keep in our minds the thought, no, we still need to respect and honor them. But then finally, if you have to make a decision, I have come to conclude, which you can take or leave it, that God's going to make Jews and non-Jews together rise throughout the Middle East and worship Jesus Christ together as one new man. Hooah. So we're going to have to close here. Now, as we do this, I'd ask you all to stand up just a minute. You can apply things as you like, but Jake's going to come up here and take an offering for our ministry. But I'd also like to give you a final invitation to this conference that we're having starting tonight. Tonight, we'll have gatherings for people, a lot coming from other nations, but we're going to be delving into some strong issues that we would love you to have to come, but primarily that you'd have come have a visitation of God. It's called kissed for a reason, because all of your understanding is shoved aside when God kisses you. What you need is an experience with God, and we hope that you would all come and experience him with us. God bless you, Jake. Want to come up here? Thanks.